We're going to continue on with the rocket here, left off at part 1. I'm going to move on to adding in some more details to it. So the first thing we want to add in is we're going to add in a nose cone. And literally, we're going to start here with just a cone. Okay. Now, our cone, of course, is sitting in there. So I'm going to turn on the wireframe so I can see it. There it is right there, obviously still selected. And I'm going to take it and drag it up, straight up to the top. There it is right there. Okay, so now I've got my cone up top. Turn on my shading. Now that is not how I want to end up with the rocket. What I would like is kind of a rounded off cone, something a little fancier that actually conforms to the shape of the rocket. So the first thing I'm going to do is go up here, turn on my attribute editor, and I'm going to select polycone 1, and I'm going to change the number of subdivisions in the height. And remember, the more subdivisions I have, the more detail I can get. So I've added in some subdivisions here, and I'm up to 7 on the height. So what that's going to let me do is, again, let me have a little more distortion there. I'm going to press Q. That's going to deselect my move tool. And I'm going to right click on that and choose Vertex Mode. I want to be in Vertex Mode. So remember, Vertex Mode is when I can edit my vertices. All right, so now I can see all my vertices. I'm going to select the top one here. Now, of course, if I just press W to move it, I'm only going to move that one lone little vertex. That's not going to make much of a difference. I'm going to have to go through and move all of them to change the shape of this. What I can do is I can use something called a soft select. And a soft select happens when you press the B key. So I've pressed the B key, and I've turned soft select mode on. And you can see soft select mode because it changes the highlighting of my edges, makes it kind of a rainbow color. Now, soft select will vary the amount of influence. So you can see I'm moving my top, and it's moving all of the points around the top, but it's not moving them as much. It kind of falls off. Now, what I want to do is set the region of influence, like how big an area that is influencing. So I'm just going to zoom out here and hold my B key down and drag my mouse. So I am left clicking and dragging my mouse, and you can see this great big blue circle here. This is my region of influence. So I'm going to make that a little bit smaller, dragging off to the right, and now you can see that it is a little less than the size of my cone. I'm just going to let go and zoom in, and you can actually see what's happened now is I've changed my region of influence for the soft select. So it's only influencing these top vertices. So when I move my top, you can see that it's moving the other vertices as well, just not as much. So if I move the top, say if I move the top 1 centimeter up, then these would move up by maybe about 0.75 centimeters. These would move up a little bit less, a little bit less, a little bit less, down to here, and they would not move up at all. I can change those settings if I double-click on my selection arrow. Here's my options for soft selection. And you can see right here, here is my fall-off radius. So that was what I set by changing my B key. I can make that larger. Here is the fall-off curve, and you can see how it changes. So this is close to where the object I've selected is, and this is farther away, how much influence it has. I can change the weighting of that. Different types of weighting. And of course, there's the colors you can see. So lots of different ways I can play around with that. I'm just going to hit the reset tool, so that resets to defaults. And again, go back to my move tool. So now I'm going to move my cursor around, and what I want to do is change the shape of my cone up top here, something a little more suited to kind of a nose cone. I'd like it pointy. Okay. So there's a nice kind of a pointy nose cone, a little bit too big though. So I'm going to press B to turn off the soft select. I'm going to switch back to object mode and maybe just scale that down a bit. Oh, something like that. Okay, so there's a nose cone. It would be nice. Let's see if I can just move that down just a little bit so it's a little more flush with. Okay, there we go. So now you can see I've made a nose cone that is more or less flush with the surface of my rocket. And of course it's a separate object from my rocket. So that's using the soft select tool. All right, so the next thing we want to do is go ahead and make some fins for our rocket. So to do the fins, again, I'm going to start off with a specific object. I'm going to start off with a cube, and there's my cube right in the center there. I'm going to drag that out because I'd rather have it working over here. Rotate, pan, track. And what I'm going to do is I am going to resize that. So squash it down fairly narrow and stretch it out. And then we'll move it a little bit just so it's out. Okay, so there's going to be the fin of my rocket. Before I work on that though, again, I want to do the same thing as I've done before. This is Polycube 1, and I am going to resize the number of subdivisions. Now, notice that I am choosing subdivision width, and that is affecting the number of subdivisions that are along the x-axis. So width is the x-axis. It would be nice if these were color-coded. They would correspond to the axes right here, but they're not. So it's either width or depth. There, that's the one I want. I want a depth. Now, if your rocket has a different orientation from mine, yours might be width, but it's definitely not height. There's height right there. So I'm going to divide that up into 10 subdivisions. So I've got 10 rectangles along here. Now I need those 10 subdivisions because what I'm going to do is distort this object, and to distort the object I need more subdivisions. So the more subdivisions you have, the finer the distortion is, the fewer, the less you'll get. Alright, so there's my fin right there. And what I'm going to do first of all is I want it wider at the bottom and narrower at the end. So I'm going to go up to the Deform menu here. And actually, first of all, I'm going to just hit Q, change my selection. I'm going to go up now. I've got my box selected, so I'm going to add what's called a handle to it, a deformer handle. And that one is called a flare. Okay, so I have added my flare tool to my handle, or to my fin here. It's now attached to that. So anything I do to the flare tool, it's going to distort this. First thing I want to do before I do anything with the flare tool is I would like to align it with the axis of my fin. So I'm just going to use my rotate tool. This acts like an actual object. I can rotate it, I can move it, I can scale it. I'll press J again so I can rotate it by 15-degree increments until it is exactly aligned up there. Okay, and go back to Q. Now, so you can see I've got my flare tool here, and the flare tool, turning on the wireframe, just consists of a line and a couple of circles at the end. So the idea is I can change the diameter of these circles and the object will follow along with it. So if I go up here to my flare 1, I can see start flare X, start flare Z, end flare X, end flare Z, curve, low bound, high bound. Well, we'll take a look at what that does. So if I hit start flare X, you can see that it changes the shape of the circle on one end. And you can see end flare X changes the shape of the circle on the other end. So obviously it's changing it in the X direction. Now, if I take a look, and I'll turn my shading back on, what you can see is that that is influencing my cube. It's not a cube anymore. It's not a bar anymore. It's stretched out. So if I flare it out, flaring just means to widen it. So I can make it wide at one end and narrow at the other. So that's what a flare does. Now, if I hadn't rotated it, it would be flaring the wrong things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my end flare, I'm going to make that fairly narrow. And then I'm going to rotate it down and do the same thing with Z. I'll make that fairly narrow as well. And with the start Z, I'll make that fairly large. So I get a nice little triangle right here, or rather triangular shape. The curve will either show how it flares. It'll either go straight or flare it out. So I'm going to have a little bit of a curve in there. So there's my fin right there. I've distorted it with my flare tool and changed it up. And again, if I did not have those subdivisions there, the flare would not work as well. The more subdivisions, the more subtle this gradation is. You don't want too many subdivisions though, because that starts to increase the poly count, and that can actually slow your computer down. So there's my flare tool. The next thing I want to do is I want to bend this fin. So it's going to bend a bit, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to select my fin. I'm going to go up to the deform menu, nonlinear, and bend. So now I've got a bend tool. And what the bend tool does is it bends things. So you can see it's actually bending my fin, curving it along the axis there. Unfortunately, it's bending it the wrong way. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to rotate my bend tool. And again, J, actually let's undo that rotate. Press J first, then start rotating. And you can see how the bend axis changes with how the rotation is. So the bend influences my fin depending on how it's rotated. So since I rotated it by 90 degrees, now the bend is curving it this way. I don't want to bend it that way. I want to bend it downwards. So I'm going to rotate it one more time. And again, rotate that by 90 degrees. And you can see now, a little too far, I think. Let's rotate around to see that. Yep, that's where I wanted it. So now you see the bend is running along the long axis of my object. However, it bent both sides. I didn't really want to bend both sides. So what I can do is I can change the boundaries. And again, I'm going to turn on wireframe here because it's easier to see. So here is the axis of bending, and here's the actual bending itself. So you can see how it's bending along this curve right here. Now, I can change the boundaries. So you can see if I change the lower boundary, it's showing what is being bent. So if I drop that down to 0, you can see my bend starts where my bend tool is centered and goes outwards. That is the high bound. Now, of course, I can increase the high bound, but of course there's nothing to bend down here. So what I can also do is I can move my bend tool, and as I move my bend tool, notice how its influence is felt all along the fin. So what I want to do is move my bend tool to about the root of the fin right here, and I want to bend the fin downwards So something like that. I want a little piece that just straightens out at the bottom for it to land on. So I can play around with this for quite a while, seeing what it looks like. That fin might be a little bit big for this rocket. I might scale that down a bit. So that is the flare tool and the bend tool and how it affects polygons. Now, what I'm going to do last thing is I'm going to move this whole assembly downwards because it shouldn't be sticking out of the side of the rocket. I'd rather have it sticking out of the bottom. Just be careful with this because if I select just the fin and I move the fin, notice how the bending changes. And notice that the bend tool and the flare tool are still in the same place. So I've got to make sure, because if I can move the bend tool and the flare tool independent of the fin, the object, then vice versa. I should be able to move all three. I'm going to select all of these things. So I've got my flare selected, bend selected, drag that down a bit until I can see exactly where I am there. Okay. So the last thing I'd like to do is maybe just a couple of things here. Scale this down just a bit. Use the center scale. Make it a little smaller. And of course, notice when I'm scaling it, it actually starts to move the relationship of the bend tool and the flare tool. So any adjustments I make at this point are going to be kind of a global effect, and they'll have maybe some unexpected effects on what I'm doing. But that actually, fortunately, looks good to me because I would like that to be more or less parallel to the hull of my ship. And I'm going to make sure it goes inside of my ship there. Okay. And, yep, that's good for now. Okay. Liking that. So what I'd like to do next is I'd like to add some more fins onto this. So I'm going to make some copies and go all the way around. So to do that, obviously I could try and mirror it and rotate it. Maya has its own mirror functions. So what I'm going to do is select just the fin here, and I'm going to go to Edit, Duplicate Special. Okay, now this is the settings box for Duplicate Special, so I can change the settings that I have to duplicate it. I'm going to click on this, and you can see right here that I can change the geometry type. I would like an instance geometry type, and I'll explain that in a bit. I would like to rotate it by 90 degrees. I'm going to change that to 90. I do not want any translation. I'm going to set that back to 0. And the number of copies I want is 3. Now, here's a little bit of a trick. When I apply that, notice how it rotated it all about the center. Now, if you're familiar with Rhino, this is similar to a polar array. And in Rhino, it asks you for the center of the polar array. Same thing with AutoCAD. Well, Maya does not ask you for the center of the polar array. Maya assumes the center of the polar array is your pivot point right here. So this is the object's pivot point. All objects, when they're created, you will see have these pivot points, and these are the things the handles we use to grab and we move them. Now, the problem with the pivot point is that that is the center of the object. So Maya assumes that's the center of the object. If I want to do a rotation, a polar array, it's going to rotate it about this point right here. So I need to move this point. And I need to move the point so it's in the center of the axis of the rocket. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to turn on my panel layout so I can see all of my views. Now, to move a pivot point, I've got it selected with the Move tool. I'm going to hold the D key down. And you can see the D key creates this new kind of icon. So here's all the icons that I need. Now, while I am holding the D key down to move my pivot point, I'm also going to reach over and press the J key because that will allow me to snap. Should allow me to snap. I would like to snap to the grid point. it's snapping. Okay, except I think that was... All right. So my pivot point is now moved to the center of my rocket, and I can see from the top view right here, it lines up with the center. So now, I'll switch back here. When I do that same function, duplicate special, okay, apply, okay. That is what I wanted. So it rotated it all the way around. You can see exactly what I wanted here. I'm going to go up here and turn the grid off so I can see my rocket. Slight problem here. I notice my porthole, my fin and my porthole are not in the same place, or rather they're overlapping a bit. I'd prefer not to have that. Now, this is why I wanted to use create an instance. So you notice that I said edit, duplicate special, and make an instance. Now, what an instance is it is a copy of the original, obviously, but anything I do to the original will cascade down to the instance. So, for example, I've got my original selected, and I'll go to my flare tool. So maybe I want to change the flare Z a little bit. So narrow it down. So now my fin is down underneath my, and you notice that that cascaded to all of the other fins. So if you want to create that instance and copy it over, then that will work. Okay, so there is a rocket. Now the last thing we want to do is add a little color to this. Adding color is pretty straightforward. I'm going to go back to Q, hit my select tool. Any object I want, if I right click on it and go down to assign new material. Okay, so maybe I'll choose I'll start off with a standard surface. And here is my attribute editor for the standard surface. Let's add some color. We'll make this red. Here is the body, and I'm going to right click, assign new material, standard surface. Let's make this blue. And if I want to go back, I can check my material attributes here. Maybe I want to have a little bit of metalness to it. Make it a little reflective. Okay, so you can see the blue's a little more reflective, a little more metallic. So you can go ahead and add in some more colors there. Okay, so there we go. And there was our rocket.